are the key considerations that employers should be keeping in mind to navigate through when it comes to health and safety obligations?
Well, certainly, as you said, Laura, health and safety was some of the earliest impact, and that's where we saw some of the earliest responses with employers trying to deal with everything that the pandemic had done to their workplaces. And it's interesting to note that across the different jurisdictions in Canada, there is a bit of a spectrum, but the obligations are quite similar. Their phrase is either taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances or ensuring health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable. But despite these differences in wording, it's clear that obligations are pretty extensive across the country. And as a result of these extensive health and safety obligations, the question employers must ask themselves as they're trying to navigate this new landscape is, what does it mean to ensure health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable or take every reasonable precaution in the circumstances? And in this case, what's complicated for employers is that the answer is kind of in the question. It's going to depend on the circumstances, which means that there's no quick fix. For every employer, this is going to be a case-by-case analysis, and it's going to depend on the specific workplace and the overall situation that the workplace is in. Right now, that's the pandemic, and what's reasonable in the circumstances in the pandemic is different than what we may have seen 6 months ago. This, as you've said, this has generated new concerns, and we've seen that employees are maybe mistrustful, more concerned about germs and touching either items or having contact with others that can lead to infection. And also employers need to be concerned about the fact that the definition of the workplace may have shifted. And we're going to talk about more details related to that in the next segment, where we talk about work from home and the health and safety implications related to that. If employers don't meet health and safety obligations, they do face significant exposures. For example, fines under occupational health and safety legislation can get quite high. And here in Ontario, the fine can go up to $1.5 million for a corporation. And because of the current nature of the situation that we're in, as Joel mentioned, lots of jurisdictions, all of them really, have issued some sort of emergency orders or public health directives related to health and safety in some way. So if the health and safety obligations aren't being met, employers can also find themselves violating these emergency orders and public health directives. And to make sure that employers are meeting their obligations, they really need to know what the risks are in their particular workplaces. So one of the key things to make sure that you're doing there is conducting a proper risk assessment. And even though it does really vary and has to be tailored to the workplace, there are generally 3 categories of activities that employers need to engage in here. The first is identifying hazards that are particular to your workplace and how you conduct work. The second is going to be evaluating the risk that each of these hazards poses. And the third is going to be to come up with solutions to address these risks and minimize them. And again, when going through this exercise, employers really have to consider their new reality and ask questions like, has anything changed about how we perform work or where work is performed? And for a lot of employers, the answer is already yes. More employers are doing more cleaning and sanitization in the workplace. There are increased personal protective equipment requirements that may not have been there before. And with the government talking about things like the increased importance of testing and making sure that everybody is tested, it may be that making sure that employers, even if they're the employees, even who may be asymptomatic, are tested, may be something that employers need to do to address risks that they may have in their particular workplace. But as you mentioned, this really isn't something that employers need to do all by themselves. Conducting a really robust risk assessment that works for your workplace is something that can be really helped by having employee representation and feedback through the process. And this is where employers can leverage the internal responsibility system, or IRS, that really underlies health and safety legislation across the country. And this means that employers certainly do have obligations, but so do supervisors and workers generally to take reasonable measures to protect their own health and safety and that of others in the workplace. And employers can really leverage this to address risks related to things like hygiene and sanitization, and also incident reporting. And as Joel mentioned when he was going through the timeline, another tool that governments have given employers to work with is industry-specific guidelines about what actually constitutes meeting your obligations with respect to health and safety. However, again, this needs to be taken in context because it is a case-by-case assessment. So simply relying on the industry guidelines the government has released isn't going to be a quick fix. Employers are really going to need to make sure that they take what's necessary from there as a guideline, but then they may need to make adjustments that are appropriate for their workplace. And doing this is going to help employers make sure that they're meeting their due diligence obligations under health and safety to show that they've actually met all the obligations that they need to meet. And other steps that employers are going to need to consider when trying to demonstrate due diligence is recording the basis or authority for the measures that they're taking. Why are you doing what you're doing, and why are you implementing the kinds of solutions to minimize risks? Also making sure that policies, protocols, and work instructions are clearly documented, and perhaps instituting mechanisms for incident reporting. And again, just as you usually would, making sure that everybody is trained on health and safety requirements and that they're clearly communicated.